Hello, sippers. I'm Martia.
I'm Demetrius.
And I'm Renee.
And welcome to today's episode of the Sip and Unwine True Crime Podcast. Hey, ladies. Hey, sippers.
Hey, what's
sippers.
going on?
Sippers, if you didn't already know, although we are a true crime podcast, we also discuss many other topics. So please make sure you keep listening after our case discussion because we have a few other segments you don't want to miss. Okay, ladies, so let me tell the sippers what we're sipping on for this episode.
Yes,
Believe it or not, sippers, we have the good old strawberry daiquiri, and we spiked our strawberry daiquiris tonight, not just with the rum that goes in your little daiquiri or whatever.
Girl, tell them.
So we've spiked our strawberry daiquiris with some Moscato. It gives it a nice sweet taste, nice little cool beverage for this warm weather. You can find the recipe details posted on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter pages as always. Now, before I begin speaking on this case, sippers, I want to acknowledge the people that these crimes have left a lasting impact on. We want to send our heartfelt sympathy to not only the survivors, but also the loved ones and friends of all the victims we are about to discuss. All right, sippers and ladies. So today's case takes us back to the year 1982 and over to the cities of Wilkes-Barre City in Jenkins Township, Pennsylvania. I'm going to discuss the case of George Emil Banks. I want to share the names of the 13 victims in this case, but let me first apologize if I pronounce any of these names wrong. The first victim is Sharon Mazzillo, her son, Kismayu Banks, her nephew, Scott Mazzillo, Alice Mazzillo, who is Sharon's mother, Regina Clemens, Montezuma Banks, she's the daughter of George and Regina, Susan Uhas, Bowendi Banks, who is the son of George and Susan, Marciana Banks is the daughter of George and Susan, Dorothy Lyons, who is also George Banks' girlfriend, Nancy Lyons, who is the daughter of George and Dorothy, Fora Rao Banks, who is Dorothy's and George's son, and Raymond Hall, who was a bystander when this crime occurred. And then there are also 4 survivors, Keith Mazzillo, Alice's grandson and Sharon's younger brother. And we have Angelo Mazzillo, who is also Alice's grandson and Sharon's other younger brother. James Olson, he was actually a bystander who was with Raymond Hall, so he survived. And then there was an unidentified man who was held at gunpoint by George, but George actually let him go, so he didn't harm him.
Oh my goodness, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, so that's 13 people, and I'm not sure if you ladies noticed, I'm sure you did, some of these people were George's own children. So in September 1982, George Emil Banks was relieved of his duties as a Camp Hill prison guard after he had a conflict with a supervisor. That same day, he had also threatened to kill himself while he was on the job. And after all of that went down, he was taken in for a mental health evaluation, which ended up being one of several. After the mental health evaluation was conducted, it was determined that George was filled with hate and anger at the world in general. They didn't institutionalize him because even though he did say he was going to commit suicide, he wasn't homicidal. So because he didn't appear to be a threat to others or a danger to others, they went ahead and let him go. The only thing that was on George's criminal past was before he became a prison guard, he had served 7.5 years for attempted robbery back in the 1960s. So other than that jail term, he wasn't considered to be a threat to anyone around him or anyone in society. Later on that same month, on September the 24th, 1982, 40-year-old George Emil Banks went to bed after taking a mixture of prescription drugs and straight gin. The next day, on September 25th, George woke up that morning and he decided to choose violence for whatever reason. As the day went on, he would go out and kill a total of 13 people while injuring 4 others. George woke up that morning and he actually had 3 living girlfriends. So he had the girlfriends that lived there.
Same time?
Yes, it was 3 girlfriends in the house. Okay. I think he might have been married to one, but I know for sure that he had a relationship with 3 of those women that lived in his home. And then there were kids. So there was a total of 8 people living in the house with him. They helped him get dressed. Those women helped him get dressed that morning. He put on some military style army fatigue clothing, and he left the house with his AR-15 automatic weapon after he took the life of his family. And one of the women in his life, I don't know which one exactly, but they gifted him that gun, which is just,
wow.
Talk about the irony of it all.
Yeah. Oof.
During the year leading up to the tragedy, George Banks' mental state had greatly declined, and there was only speculation as to what was actually going on in his mind before the horrific crime spree began. So when he woke up that morning, he was in a self-induced haze from all of that stuff, the pills, the alcohol. He had passed out. And when he woke up, he had his 4-year-old son sleeping next to him while his girlfriends, 29-year-old Regina Clemens, 23-year-old Susan Uhas, and 29-year-old Dorothy Lyons were sitting in chairs nearby. And Susan was actually holding their 1-year-old daughter, Martiana, in her arms when George woke up. And basically, it was in that moment that he reached down, picked up his gun, loaded it with a 30-round clip, and basically he sat there getting his assault rifle ready and started saying some things as he was angry and shot Regina Clemens. The bullet pierced her right cheek and went downward and traveled directly through her heart, killing her instantly. Her body was basically slumped over sideways and she was lifeless.
God.
Susan and Dorothy both were frozen with fear. They basically just stood there and watched George. He got up and he shot Susan 5 times in the chest at point blank range as she was screaming and hollering for him to stop. A single bullet entered Marciana's left ear and exited her right eye as Susan tried to basically shield her from the hail of bullets. Dorothy tried to flee when she saw what was going on and she shielded her face, but he fired 2 more rounds at her, with the first bullet piercing her arm and chest, and the second one entered her neck as she fell to the floor and basically died instantly. Bowendies, one of the children, turned away from his father when a single bullet rang out and it traveled through his left cheek and exited his right ear, basically killing him instantly because he shot the baby in his head. It's just terrible. And 6-year-old Montezuma was sitting up in her bed, but she woke up from the gunfire that she heard. And when she woke up, that's the time that her father, George, walked into the room and he shot her point blank in the chest, and he fired a second shot into her head and she fell dead on the floor. And as George moved down the hallway, he went into Nancy's room, that's his 11-year-old daughter, and she was sitting on her bed holding her half-brother, 1-year-old Farron Banks, in her arms, and she looked up and basically her dad fired shots at her. He shot her in the back of the head with the bullet entering her head and exiting out of her eye, and he shot Nancy in the left forearm and in the face. So both children passed away instantly. And when he went outside, basically he had it in his mind that he was going to another house to commit some more crimes. And that's when he encountered 22-year-old James Olson and 24-year-old Ray Hall. They were leaving a house in that same neighborhood, and George approached them and opened fire on them. It was several other men in the vicinity as well, but those 2 men were struck. So unfortunately, James Olson, he passed away from his injuries, but Ray did end up surviving. Shortly thereafter, George got in his car and he drove over to a place called Heather Highlands Mobile Home Park, where one of his former girlfriends, Sharon Mazzillo, lived there with their 5-year-old son, Kisamiyu. George basically forced his way into her home and he shot 24-year-old Sharon. He then shot his son in the head, 5-year-old son in the head, as he slept in his bed. George also killed Sharon's mother, 47-year-old Alice Mazzillo, and Sharon's younger brother, 7-year-old Scott Mazzillo. Now, Sharon had 2 other brothers that were visiting that day, and they were in the house as well. 10-year-old Angelo Mazzillo and 13-year-old Keith Mazzillo, they actually escaped unharmed because Keith was hiding in a closet while Angelo hid under the bed. Both of the boys were in the same room as their grandmother when she was murdered, but Keith actually witnessed his grandmother getting killed, and he would eventually become one of the witnesses that would help identify the killer in this gruesome crime. It's also noted that Sharon and George were in the middle of a custody dispute. So it's so sad because when George went over to Sharon's house and committed those murders, Sharon's mother was actually on the phone when she heard the gunshot. She was trying to call for help. But unfortunately, that's when he walked in and killed her. The babies, the 10-year-old and 13-year-old little brothers, Keith and Angelo, after George left, they were able to run and get help. But the 7-year-old brother who got killed, he was so scared that he basically ran out of the room where they were all hiding in the closet. But when the 7-year-old ran out, not only did George shoot him, but he had also kicked him to the ground and punched him in the back.
Oh my gosh, that is horrible.
7 years old.
Yeah.
7 years old. So sad.
Like he was a grown man,
Wow.
Right, exactly. When police discovered the victims in the mobile home, because again, the boys that were able to witness it, they were able to get help. But the police were able to make an immediate connection with the shooting at the mobile mobile home, and also the shooting that happened in the Wilkes Barre area, the first home. And immediately there was a manhunt put out for George for those killings. The car he drove, he ended up abandoning that car. And then, like I stated earlier, one of the survivors was a man that he carjacked at gunpoint, and he stole that man's car. Now, for whatever reason, when he decided to carjack that guy, basically he asked that man if he wanted to leave. And of course, the guy was like, hell yeah. I don't know what his exact quote was, but he definitely was like, yes, let me up out of here. And he let that man go for whatever reason. And after George drove around in that stolen car, he found this desolate area where he wandered around and ended up passing out in some grass. Because now, mind you, he's still high on whatever he did. When he passed out, he woke up, he was still high off of all of that. So when George ended up waking up from passing out in that grass, his mother told authorities that her son showed up to her home crying. He smelled like liquor. And then while he was there, he threatened his mother, and he told her that he wanted her to take him wherever he needed to go, or there would be a shootout. His mother asked him what happened, and
to his own mom?
To his own mom. Right. Now at that time, she didn't even know what he had done, but she knew he had gotten into something because of how he showed up at her home. So, but she had no idea at that moment that he had already basically shot and killed several people. So when his mother asked him what happened, he said, it's all over. I did it. He said, I killed everyone. His mother asked him who he killed, and he said, I killed them all, Mom. I killed all the kids and the girls, Regina, Sharon, them all. So after that strange encounter, George's mother basically called his house. She just called hoping that her son was just drunk and talking crazy. And she was just like, okay, hopefully somebody at this house will answer the phone. But no one that she knew answered the phone, but the police were at the house. So they're the ones that picked up on the other end.
Wow.
Yeah. So when she was like,
about that, you call it in, the police answer. So you know that it's true. Like something.
Exactly.
You know that he actually did that.
Right. Wow. So when George was standing over his mother and he heard that she was talking to the police or whatever, he grabbed the phone from her and he asked the police, he said, well, how are my children doing? And when the police realized that's who they were, police realized who they were talking to, they said, okay, we're going to try to stall and keep him on the phone so we can figure out where he's at. So they ended up telling him that the kids were still alive. So this made George furious. He started screaming, and he said he knew that the police were lying because he killed them. And then he hung up the phone. After he disconnected that call, he put about 30 more rounds of ammunition into his gun, and he left his mother's house in a rage.
Oh my God. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, he left his mom's house with a loaded gun, and he ended up at a rental house where basically a standoff would ensue between him and the police. So when the police surrounded the house, they basically had George's mother come to the scene, and they tried several different tactics to try to get him out of that house without having to use force and violence. So they tried to have a false news report air over the radio saying that George's kids were still alive and they needed blood to survive. The neighboring houses had to be evacuated during all of this because of the standoff, but police were not able to get him to come out. They basically exhausted all their tactics, and they ended up contacting one of George's former co-workers named Robert Brunson to try and come and talk George out of the house. And I don't know what the man said, but it worked, because after 4 hours of a standoff, George was handing his rifle.
That is a long standoff.
It is, right. And imagine all the hours of the crime spree that happened before this.
Yeah.
So George handed his rifle out through a window, and he gave himself up to authorities. George basically said he killed his kids because he didn't want them to be tormented by the cruelty of racial views against mixed race children. Most of the victims were caught off guard when the massacre happened. So he basically snuck up on everybody because most of them were sleeping in their beds or they were watching TV. So
his reason was because they were mixed?
That's what he said.
When he made those choices? Like, if he felt that strong, why did he even deal with people outside of his race in the beginning?
Right. Why procreate?
Right. Exactly.
Wow.
And yeah, so there was no real reason found for the murders, besides what he said, of course, but there were reports from neighbors of domestic disputes between George and those 3 girlfriends that he lived with. And neighbors did describe him, and friends described him as being a good father. And they said he was a highly religious man who actually had a mail order minister's degree, but also said that he was fascinated with weapons and making bombs. And it's crazy because I'm like, what is a mail order minister's degree? Like, like back in 1982, we weren't all operating on computers like we are today. So I wonder what he had to fill out, or what did he learn to actually get a minister's degree, mail order.
I guess what are your qualifications? What do you need to have? I guess
exactly.
Because anybody can have a church, right? At this point.
Yeah, so that's true.
Have your own religion. That's crazy.
Right. So George was accused of 8 counts of murder initially: attempted murder, aggravated assault, recklessly endangering another person, stealing a car, robbery, and theft. And so before I get into George's trial, I want to go into a little bit more of his background information. All right. So George Emil Banks was born on June 22nd, 1942, and he was born and raised in Wilkes-Barre, and he was the son of a white woman and of a black man. So basically he was mixed himself. His parents never married, and the racial mix seemed to torment him throughout his life. He went to a Catholic school where he was basically labeled as an underachiever, but he did have an IQ of 121. But George believed when he was a youngster that he was shunned and abused by both whites and blacks throughout his childhood because of his biracial status. So that's kind of where his mindset comes in at. He was quoted as saying, "I've dealt with racial cowards all my life." A lot of things happened during that time when he referred back to his childhood. And he was also just remembering that there were several kids that just used to bully him for no reason, trying to see if he wanted to fight or whether he could fight. Besides kids always trying to fight him and bully him, basically, he said his problems got worse as he got older, and he felt like he was being constantly harassed, including a time in 1959 where George said he almost got lynched for drinking a soda and eating a donut on the sidewalk. Now, this is just a side note in my personal opinion, because I do feel like, okay, back in those times, he probably was targeted because of his skin color, because that's kind of what happened back then. But I don't feel like it was because he was mixed. I mean, maybe it could have been. I kind of felt like a part of me thinks, okay, he's making a problem almost like he was the only one experiencing this, right? Like, here's why I feel this way, because my kids are mixed and the world is cruel. But it was like cruel for a lot of black people, mixed and black people back then. Right. But anyway, while he was in his early 20s, George saw the military as a way to escape all his troubles, and he signed up for a tour of duty in the Army. The problem was, after just like 2 years of being in the Army, he was discharged because he couldn't get along with the officers, and basically they gave him a general discharge. And it's noted that his life went on a downward spiral from that point. So back in September of 1961, George and 2 other accomplices tried to rob a bar, and basically the crime went left from the beginning. So when the bar worker was confronted by George and his assailant, the guy's name was Thomas Roche, R-O-C-H-E, or Roche. He refused to cooperate with the robbers, and George pulled out a pistol and shot him in the chest. And basically him and his 2 accomplices, they got away, but when they were caught, George did get sentenced to 6 to 15 years in prison. But like I said earlier, he only served 7.5 of those years. And I'm not sure if the victim survived or not, but because it doesn't say that he was charged with murder, I'm wondering about that. So I couldn't find any information about whether the victim survived or not after being shot in the chest. But I just feel like with certain crimes, even if it's one thing, I just feel like people should get a lot more time than just 7 years for basically attempted murder. And he should have never been able to serve as a prison guard anywhere.
Now, wait a minute. What year did this happen?
That was back in 1961.
That's 61. Okay.
So after he got out of jail from serving those 7.5 years, he did marry a woman named Doris, and she was a longtime girlfriend. Her name was Doris Jones, and she was a black woman, and he had 2 daughters with her. So she was a longtime girlfriend. He married her when he got out, but they did eventually separate. And once they did, that's when he purchased the home where he got his girlfriends to live with him, and all of his girlfriends were white, and most of them were at least 10 years younger than him. So he was easily able to manipulate them, because some of the women that he brought into the home, they were homeless, and basically he ended up being their way to get off the streets. And it was almost like a cult type of lifestyle that he was living. So he had 2 of his girlfriends were actually sisters, and with all the women that lived in that house, he basically had kids with all of them as well. All right, so Regina was George's first lover, and she became pregnant before he even separated from his wife, and they had a daughter in 1976. And then Sharon moved in, which is one of the ex-girlfriends. She didn't stay with him for that long. She moved in with them and she had a son in 76. And then Regina moved in, which was Susan's sister, and she had a baby in 1977. And after the children were born, they said that George's mental state began to deteriorate from there. So that's when he got his job at the correctional center, and all of his problems started to come up, like financial problems, problems in the house, problems with the job. And he also lived in a predominantly white neighborhood. And it's kind of interesting to just hear the dynamics of his background, because he talked about how he was mistreated by the very people that he went and procreated with, lived with, and worked with. So yeah, very interesting dynamic.
So it kind of seemed like this story is far-fetched, like that may not have been the true underlining of why he actually did.
I know, because you didn't like it, but then you make a life just like that,
dived head first into it like it was a pool of water. And then he said that while he was living in that neighborhood, his white neighbors would try to intimidate the women he was bringing into the home. He said that the white people called his kids African N-words. He even said his home was firebombed and said that those white people tried to burn his home down. So, I mean, I don't know if there were any records about him calling the police, but that's a lot of things to be putting up with in the late 70s when the racial tension kind of started to calm down during that time, right? Maybe not everywhere, but he sure did go through a lot. But he put himself into this situation. I'm not saying that he deserved to be harassed if that's what it was, right? But he went into the very place that he felt like he was always mistreated. That's interesting to me. So he said that the neighbors treated him so bad that he basically was secluded. He didn't want his kids to play with their kids. He didn't want their kids in his yard. He didn't like any of the girlfriends talking to the neighbors. And basically he tried to keep them from not even going out as much because of the town that they lived in. And he just didn't like being around white people. But that's just really interesting to me. So with him getting fired from work, I think that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. Is that the saying? And he had reached a breaking point, and even going through that custody dispute with Sharon, because he basically wanted full control of the custody of the children. And he was so angry that Sharon wouldn't give up the kid that she had with him. So they were in court proceedings for that. And that is part of what they say pushed him into drinking and doing drugs. So after the crime spree happened, George was deemed fit to stand trial, even though listening to it is kind of like, no, this guy basically lost his mind. And his trial began on June 6, 1983 in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. But I have to say, it's really tripping me out that they deemed him fit to stand trial. They should have just threw him in jail or prison without deeming him anything.
I think they do have to prove them like being sane in order to sentence.
Oh, okay.
I think certain courts and states have to prove that.
Oh, okay. Got it. Well, he would plead not guilty and then later testify that he was not insane. So the case included testimony from several witnesses from the multiple crime scenes, several of George's family members, and also the man that he shot outside of his home, the guy James Olson. George would actually tell the jury that he killed the women and children because he loved them. He talked about the shootings in a calm manner, like he was just telling a normal story as he was sitting there talking to the jury.
Wait a minute. You don't love somebody to the point of that.
Right.
That was cold-blooded.
Exactly. He showed little emotion until he spoke on the deaths of his two daughters. And when he talked about them, he did bow his head for a minute and wiped his eyes. He told the jury that he was not responsible for all the damages that they saw in the crime scene photos. And he was quoted as saying, "My people died because I love them." And he said the shootings were the culmination of 41 years of racial abuse heaped upon me in this country. And he also added, "I can't explain what was going on in my mind at the time." So the jury found George guilty of 12 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of third-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, and 1 count each of robbery, theft, and endangering the life of another person. On June 22nd, 1983, the jury recommended the death penalty for 41-year-old George Banks. George was sentenced to death by electrocution, but later declared by the courts to be too psychotic to execute him. Right. Yep. So George appealed his case several times from 1987 to 2000, but courts refused to hear the argument regarding mental competency. He was set to be executed by lethal injection, but like I said, he was basically granted a stay of execution on December 2004. Fast forward to May 2010, and George was basically declared incompetent. And since his conviction, George has tried to kill himself at least 4 times, and he's gone on hunger strikes, which required him to be force-fed. And I didn't even know that they did that. Like, I didn't know if you go on a hunger strike in jail or prison that they would force feed you. But in a psychiatric report,
I thought they just let you go.
That's what I thought too. Right. In a psychiatric report, it's documented that George believed he was in a spiritual fight with an antichrist in New York, and that Pennsylvania was controlled by Islams. And he was also saying that he was engaged in a private war with President Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. So, I mean,
I don't think it worked like that, but
right, exactly.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, basically, he is still in prison.
So they can't execute him at all. Is that what that was?
No.
Or is it until he can prove that he's fit and then they can execute him? Or is it since he's too psychotic, like that's not going to change?
Yeah, that's not going to change. He basically is just going to be in prison for the rest of his life. I think I'm confused too as to how the law works, because while they deemed him incompetent, he doesn't have to be executed, but he still has to be punished. But then what separates the punishment from execution?
Yeah.
I don't understand how that works. But while he's been in prison, George's home, it no longer stands where the crime occurred because an arson fire destroyed the home shortly after he was arrested. And the Russian Orthodox Church bought the empty lot back in 1987 from George's brother, and they were planning on building a church on the location, but the lot still remains vacant to this day. And the prison is basically the Pennsylvania State Institution, and he was dying of liver cancer on the last report here. Yeah, that's it. That is the case of George Emil Banks.
I don't know why they didn't just go and execute him.
Right.
That is so sad. I think when you take that many lives,
that was a lot too.
And especially when they're children involved. Not to say babies. No one's life is less than or more than, but that's heartbreaking. And your own at that.
Right. And let me just go down the list just to tell you the ages again, because I just want to make sure that it's more so about the victims, less about the crime, in my opinion, because when people pass away, I know their loved ones probably want to keep their memory alive. For me, this case is the most victims I've ever talked about in one case. But just a quick recap before I close this out. I just can't even believe he took all these people's lives and they were all his family. But Sharon Mazzillo, she was only 24 years old. Kismayu Banks, only 5 years old. Scott Mazzillo, he was only 7 years old. Alice Mazzillo, she was 47 years old. Then there was Regina Clemens, she was only 29 years old. Montezuma Banks, 6 years old. Susan Uhas, 23 years old. Boenda Banks, 4 years old. Marciana Banks, 20 months old. Dorothy Lyons, 29 years old. Nancy Lyons, she was the daughter of Dorothy, and I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. Forrow Banks, he was only 1. And then Raymond Hall, which was the guy that was coming out of a house in the neighborhood, he was only 24 years old. So almost all of his victims were under the age of 30, except for Sharon's mom, when she was 47. I get it. He was upset. He lost his job. He had a lot of stress, and this is probably one of the most disturbing cases that I've done. All of them are disturbing, but this, in my personal list of the cases I've covered, this is definitely the top most disturbing case.
Yeah, this is.
This one
because of the babies.
And
it's your family.
Mm-hmm. And there's no real reason behind it. Like, there really is no real reason for why the women had no idea.
And just like,
the women were sitting there chilling, like helping him get dressed, taking care of his kids and all that, and it turned into this massacre. But
because it just make you wonder though, before you close out, like what made him snap? Because that took him into a whole nother frame of mind.
Yeah, he was zoned out.
Yeah, and then to tell his mom he did it, so you were insane but sane at the same time, because you had enough common sense to tell your mom, I did it.
Right, exactly.
Because you weren't insane, because he had a reason. He had the reason of why he did. He didn't just, didn't know why he did it.
Insane because you snapped it. You had a choice. You didn't have to pick the gun up. You didn't have to hit.
That's what I'm saying, right? So he wasn't.
I hear what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is deep.
Yep, pretty crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and close the book on the George Emil Banks case, ladies.
Yes.
That was heavy. So my source for the George Banks case was Murderpedia. All right, so the next segment I'm going to move into is a missing persons case. And so this article I'm about to read for the missing persons case is coming from Our Black Girls website. And this is the case of Tamala Wells, 33 years old, last seen driving away from her Detroit home back in 2012. So the Michigan resident was said to have last been seen at her home at approximately 9:30 p.m. on August 6, 2012. At that time, Tamala was living with her boyfriend of 17 years. His name is Ricky Tennant, and it's been stated on reports that she was the mother of 2 children. Tennant is said to have seen Tamala driving away from their residence in her 4-door Pontiac Grand Prix, which was white with black bumpers, and she left the home around 10:30 p.m. according to him. An hour or so later, Tamala spoke with her mother, who lived at the time she was in Florida, Donna Davis, on the phone, and that was the last time anyone had contact with Tamala. The following morning, Tamala's 6-year-old daughter called her grandmother to say that the 33-year-old never returned home the night before. Concerns set in, and Donna did try to call her daughter, but by that same evening, those unanswered calls were going straight to voicemail. So Donna, like any mother would do, basically caught the next flight from Florida to Detroit. And they did do a search for Tamala, but nothing came up to say, where she might have been. So according to the show Disappeared, they have a website. Tamala was reported acting strangely on the evening that she disappeared. And she told her boyfriend that she had to go somewhere, but she didn't offer many details. So her boyfriend told authorities that Tamala was known to have girls' nights with her friends during the week, but she was not a person that would have abandoned her children. He was also said to have taken a polygraph test, but he failed, which y'all know with these cases where my mind goes. And y'all mind, I'm not sure if y'all think the same way as I do, but it just seems to me like the first suspect is always going to be your romantic partner.
Right.
So yeah, he failed a polygraph test, but he was never named as an official suspect in the case, and he has denied any responsibility for Tamala Wells going missing. And he basically went on to become their daughter's primary caregiver. To add more mystery to the case, the vehicle was found not too far from Tamala's home, and it only had a few minor items missing, according to her boyfriend. But when police responded to the scene, they reportedly stated that her boyfriend destroyed any potential evidence that could have been collected because of the fact that he called himself inspecting the car first.
So Ricky, get out of here.
Now that's suspicious, right?
So Ricky, sounds like Ricky was up to a lot with this whole case.
You're gonna expect it first, sure.
Right.
Let me jump ahead of the curve and let me just, go through the car myself.
Yeah, crazy. But I'm gonna still call the police so we can have it on record that I at least reported that I found it. That's crazy. Tamala Wells was reportedly a healthcare worker who came from a large family, as she was one of 6 children. And it is reported that there are no signs that a crime has been committed, but Tamala's family refuses to believe that she would just walk away from her life or her children without a trace. In 2021, community activist Minister Malik Shabazz claimed that he received an anonymous tip that Tamala Wells was at an Eaton, Michigan home on Indiana Street. And authorities did say that any viable tips would be investigated. So Shabazz told the authorities that he had some information about the house where she was supposedly at, but it was firebombed. So it was basically a lead that led to nowhere.
Firebombed?
Yeah.
People do that to houses.
I don't know exactly. Right. In an interview with Click on Detroit in 2021, Tamala's mother, Donna, said that every day I get through with the grace of God. And she says she's hoping that each day they're going to find her child. And she's made several trips over the years from Florida to Detroit to search through abandoned homes and neighborhood, doing searches on her own. And she said the worst part is just not knowing. She said there's a lot of people that lose their loved ones to diseases, gun violence, all of that. And she said her heart goes out to them, but she said, but because no one deserves to be taken from them, but she said, but at least they know where their loved one is and what happened to them.
Right.
Whereas in her case, so in her case, she's like, I have no idea. Right. Gosh. So at the time of Tamala Wells' disappearance, she stood somewhere between 5'1" to 5'6" and weighed about 150 to 180 pounds. She had black, dark brown hair styled just below her shoulders, and she wore it in micro braids, and she had brown eyes. Her middle name is Nicole. Her ears are pierced, and she had a scar under her chin and on the left side of her forehead, and she also wore acrylic nails. She was last seen wearing a white shirt, blue jean shorts with a cuff, and some earrings, and she would be 43 years old as of 2021. Anyone with information about this case is urged to contact the Detroit Police Department, and I'll definitely list the phone number on our page, which is 313-596-1800, and I'll list the information on our Instagram and Facebook page and Twitter as well, and I'll also include photos of Tamala. So hopefully her family will gain some answers as we spotlight this case.